Dark Waters. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The mist hung heavy over the small coastal village as Jacob and Emily Parker drove their rental car down the winding road. The ocean waves crashed against the rocky shore, the sound muffled by the thick fog that seemed to envelop everything in its path. They had been looking forward to this vacation for months, a chance to reconnect and escape the pressures of city life. Little did they know, this picturesque village held secrets that would turn their relaxing getaway into a nightmare. The village of Blackwater Cove was everything they had hoped for. Quaint cottages with weathered, whitewashed walls lined the narrow streets, and the scent of the sea filled the air. The locals, though few, offered warm smiles and polite nods as they passed by. But there was an unsettling stillness to the place, a quiet that felt unnatural, as if the village was holding its breath. They arrived at the inn where they would be staying, a charming stone building perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. The innkeeper, Mrs. Hawthorne, greeted them with a warm smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. But there was something about her gaze that seemed to linger too long, as if she was sizing them up. "Welcome to Blackwater Cove," she said, her voice smooth but with an edge of something unspoken. "We've been expecting you." Jacob and Emily exchanged a glance, slightly unnerved by her words, but they dismissed it as small-town hospitality. After all, they had booked the room weeks in advance. Mrs. Hawthorne led them to their room, a cozy space with a view of the ocean. The waves were calm now, but something about the dark waters made Emily uneasy. "Enjoy your stay," Mrs. Hawthorne said before leaving them alone. "And if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." As the door clicked shut, Emily turned to Jacob. "Did she seem odd to you?" Jacob shrugged, placing their bags on the bed. "Small towns are always a bit strange, but I'm sure it's nothing. Let's just enjoy our time here." But as they unpacked, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She walked to the window, staring out at the ocean. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing more of the village below. Everything seemed peaceful, yet there was an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite place. That night, as they lay in bed, Emily was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She glanced at the clock, 2:15 a.m. She held her breath, listening. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside their door. She nudged Jacob awake. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her heart pounding. Jacob listened, but the footsteps had stopped. "It's probably just another guest," he said, though he sounded uncertain. "Go back to sleep." Emily tried to relax, but the uneasy feeling persisted. She stared at the ceiling, willing herself to drift off, but sleep wouldn't come. After what felt like hours, she finally dozed off, only to be plagued by nightmares of dark water and shadowy figures. The next morning, Emily woke up feeling exhausted. As they headed downstairs for breakfast, she noticed a new guest sitting in the dining room, a man in his 30s with a haunted look in his eyes. He kept glancing at the door as if expecting someone or something to enter at any moment. Mrs. Hawthorne brought them their breakfast with the same unsettling smile. "Sleep well?" she asked, her tone polite but with that same undercurrent. "Yes, thank you," Jacob lied, sensing Emily's discomfort. As they ate, the new guest suddenly stood up, knocking over his chair. He rushed to the door, muttering something under his breath. Mrs. Hawthorne watched him leave, her smile never faltering, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Emily leaned closer to Jacob. "We need to find out what's going on here." Jacob nodded, his earlier skepticism fading. There was something wrong with this place, something that went beyond the fog and the quiet streets, and they were determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Chapter 2. The Disappearance. The following day, Jacob and Emily decided to explore the village. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting the village in a warm, golden light that almost made them forget the strange events of the night before. They wandered through the narrow streets, past the small shops and cottages, taking in the sights and sounds of Blackwater Cove. As they walked, they struck up a conversation with one of the villagers, an elderly man named Mr. Thorne. He was sitting on a bench outside a small fishing shop, his weathered face etched with lines of time and experience. "Good morning," Jacob greeted him, trying to sound cheerful. Mr. Thorne looked up, his sharp blue eyes studying them intently. "Morning," he replied, his voice rough like gravel. "You folks aren't from around here, are you?" No, just visiting, Emily said with a smile. We're staying at the inn. Mr. Thorne nodded slowly. Be careful around here, he said in a low voice. This place has its secrets. Emily's smile faltered. What do you mean? The old man glanced around as if checking to see if anyone was listening. There's a darkness in these waters, he whispered. People disappear. No one ever sees them again. Jacob frowned. What are you talking about? But before Mr. Thorne could answer, a woman appeared from one of the shops, her eyes wide with fear. He's gone, she cried out, her voice trembling. My husband, he's gone. A small crowd quickly gathered around the distraught woman. Mrs. Hawthorne appeared from the inn, her expression calm but her eyes cold. What happened, Mrs. Finch? The woman, Mrs. Finch, clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders. He went out to the cliffs last night, and he never came back. I searched everywhere this morning, but there's no sign of him. The crowd murmured in concern, but no one seemed surprised. It was as if they had been expecting this, waiting for it to happen. Jacob and Emily exchanged a worried glance. Mrs. Hawthorne placed a comforting hand on Mrs. Finch's shoulder. The sea can be treacherous, she said softly. We'll organize a search party, but we must prepare for the worst. Emily's heart sank. She had a terrible feeling that this was more than just a tragic accident. She glanced at Mr. Thorne, but the old man had already slipped away, disappearing into the crowd. As the villagers began to organize a search, Jacob and Emily decided to head to the cliffs themselves. Something about the situation didn't add up, and they needed to see for themselves. The path to the cliffs was steep and rocky, the wind whipping around them as they made their way up. When they reached the top, the view was breathtaking, a sheer drop down to the churning ocean below. But there was no sign of Mr. Finch. Emily knelt by the edge, scanning the rocks below for any sign of movement. There's nothing here, she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jacob frowned, stepping closer to the edge. Maybe he fell into the water, or... His voice trailed off as something caught his eye. Emily, look. He pointed to a small, weathered rowboat tied to a rock a short distance away. It was half submerged, the water lapping at its sides. That must be his boat, Emily said, her stomach twisting in knots. But why would he leave it there? Jacob shook his head, his expression grim. I don't know, but something's not right here. We need to talk to Mrs. Hawthorne. They hurried back to the village, their minds racing with questions. When they reached the inn, they found Mrs. Hawthorne speaking with a group of villagers. Her expression was calm, but there was a tension in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Mrs. Hawthorne, Jacob called out, trying to keep his voice steady. We need to talk. She turned to them, her smile returning. Of course. What can I help you with? Jacob glanced around, noticing how the villagers seemed to be watching them closely. We found Mr. Finch's boat at the cliffs, but there's no sign of him. Mrs. Hawthorne's smile faded slightly. The sea is unpredictable, she said quietly. Many have been lost to it over the years. But this isn't just about the sea, is it? Emily pressed, her voice trembling with emotion. There's something else going on here. Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes flickered with something. Fear, perhaps, or maybe something darker. But before she could respond, the door of the inn burst open, and the new guest from the dining room stumbled in, his face pale and his eyes wild. They're coming, he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. The dark waters, they're coming for us all. The room fell silent, and a chill ran down Emily's spine. She knew in that moment that they were in far more danger than they had ever imagined. Chapter 3. The Unseen Threat. The air inside the inn grew thick with tension as the new guest's panicked words echoed in the room. Jacob instinctively reached for Emily's hand, squeezing it tight as Mrs. Hawthorne moved toward the man, her face a mask of concern. Mr. Reynolds, she said softly, her tone soothing yet firm, calm yourself. What are you talking about? Reynolds staggered backward, his eyes wide with terror. You don't understand, he rasped, his voice breaking. I saw them, in the water. Dark shapes like shadows. They're alive, waiting. A murmur ran through the crowd of villagers, their faces darkening with unease. Emily noticed the way they exchanged glances, a silent communication that only heightened her fear. It was clear now, there was a truth that no one dared to speak. "We need to leave," Emily whispered urgently to Jacob, pulling him toward the door. But before they could move, Mrs. Hawthorne stepped in their path, her expression hardening. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," she said, her voice low and resolute. "Not now." Emily felt her heart drop. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze bore into hers, filled with a strange mix of regret and determination. "Blackwater Cove is not like other places," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "This village, we're bound to it and to the waters that surround us." Jacob's face contorted in confusion and anger. "What are you saying? You can't just keep us here." But Mrs. Hawthorne's resolve did not waver. "You don't understand the forces at work here. The waters have a power of their own and they demand a price. Those who are chosen, they never leave." A cold dread settled over Emily, the words sinking into her like a stone. "Chosen?" she repeated, her voice trembling. Mrs. Hawthorne nodded slowly. "Every few years the waters call for a sacrifice. It's always someone from outside, someone who doesn't belong. That's why we keep to ourselves, why we don't welcome outsiders. But you came here." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "You're saying we were brought here to die?" Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes softened, but there was no denying the truth in them. "It's not something we want, but it's something we must do. If we don't appease the waters, then we all pay the price." Jacob stepped forward, his fists clenched in fury. "This is insane. We're leaving now." But before they could move, the door to the inn creaked open, and a cold gust of wind swept through the room. The villagers backed away as if expecting something terrible. And then Emily saw them, shadowy figures barely visible in the dim light, standing just outside the door. They were tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed like embers in the darkness. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their movements were slow, deliberate, like predators stalking their prey. The sight of them sent a jolt of terror through Emily, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet remained frozen in place. "They've come," Mrs. Hawthorne whispered, her voice hollow. "The chosen ones have arrived." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the figures moved closer, their presence filling the room with a suffocating sense of dread. The villagers remained silent, their expressions a mix of fear and resignation. It was as if they had already accepted their fate, but Emily wasn't ready to give up. "We can't stay here," she muttered, her voice shaking. "We have to get out of this place." Jacob nodded, his jaw set with determination. "We'll find a way." But even as they spoke, the figures advanced, their dark forms looming over them like shadows from a nightmare. Emily's fear reached a breaking point, and she bolted for the door, dragging Jacob with her. The moment they stepped outside, the cold wind hit them with a force that nearly knocked them off their feet. The village was eerily quiet, the streets deserted. The only sound was the relentless crashing of the waves against the cliffs, as if the sea itself was calling to them. Emily cast a desperate glance around, searching for any means of escape, but all she saw was the dark water, endless and unforgiving. "We need to find that old man," Jacob said urgently. "He knows something, I'm sure of it." Emily nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Where do we look?" "Near the cliffs," Jacob replied. "That's where we saw him last." They hurried down the narrow streets, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The village seemed to close in around them, the buildings looming ominously as if they were watching, waiting. As they approached the cliffs, Emily's heart sank. There was no sign of Mr. Thorne. "We're running out of time," Jacob said, glancing nervously back at the village. "We need to figure out what's happening before it's too late." Emily felt a sudden sense of hopelessness wash over her. "But what if we can't? What if this is it?" Jacob grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "We're going to get through this. We have to." But even as he spoke, the dark waters below seemed to rise, the waves crashing harder against the rocks as if driven by some unseen force. And then from the depths of the sea, a low, haunting wail echoed through the air, sending a shiver down Emily's spine. "It's them," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "The ones in the water." Jacob didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the ocean met the sky. The fog was rolling in again, thicker this time, swallowing the village in its icy grip. And in the distance, barely visible through the mist, Emily saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure standing on the edge of the cliff, staring out at the sea. "Is that?" she began, but the words died in her throat as the figure turned and she recognized the face. It was Mrs. Finch's husband. Chapter 4. The Truth Unveiled. Emily's mind reeled as she stared at the figure on the cliff. The man who had disappeared, presumed lost to the sea, was standing before them, alive but eerily still. His eyes, hollow and distant, seemed to look through them as though he was no longer fully there, no longer himself. "How is this possible?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "He's supposed to be dead." Jacob took a cautious step forward, his gaze fixed on the man. "Mr. Finch?" he called out, his voice carrying over the howling wind. "Can you hear us?" But the man didn't respond. He simply stood there, his expression vacant, as if he was under some kind of spell. Emily felt a cold dread settle in the pit of her stomach. This was not natural. Whatever had happened to him, it was something far beyond their understanding. Suddenly Mr. Finch moved, turning slowly to face the sea. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical, as if he were being guided by an unseen force. And then, without warning, he began to walk toward the edge of the cliff. "No!" Emily shouted, breaking into a run. "Stop him!" Jacob followed, but before they could reach him, Mr. Finch stepped off the edge, disappearing into the fog below. Emily skidded to a halt at the edge of the cliff, her breath catching in her throat as she peered over the side. There was no sign of him, no splash, no cry for help. It was as if the ocean had swallowed him whole. "Oh my God," Emily breathed, backing away from the edge. "What's happening here, Jacob? What did we just see?" Jacob's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. "I don't know," he admitted, shaking his head. "But whatever it is, it's not just the sea. It's something else, something darker." Emily could feel the weight of his words, the truth they didn't want to acknowledge. The villagers had spoken of the sea demanding a price, of sacrifices made to keep the darkness at bay. But this was more than just superstition. This was real. "We need answers," Jacob said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "We have to find Mr. Thorne. He's the only one who might know what's really going on." Emily nodded, though her legs felt weak beneath her. The sight of Mr. Finch stepping off the cliff, so calmly and deliberately, had shaken her to the core. But they couldn't afford to fall apart now. They had to keep going, had to find the truth before it was too late. They made their way back through the village, the fog growing thicker with each passing minute. The streets were deserted, the buildings looming out of the mist like silent sentinels. The eerie stillness made Emily's skin crawl, as if the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. As they approached the inn, Emily spotted a figure moving through the fog, heading toward the cliffs. Was Mr. Thorne. "There he is," she said, pointing him out to Jacob. "Come on, we can't lose him." They hurried after the old man, following him down a narrow path that led to a secluded part of the cliffs. Mr. Thorne moved with surprising speed for someone his age, but there was a desperation in his movements, as if he was trying to outrun something that couldn't be escaped. Finally, he stopped at the edge of the cliffs, staring out at the sea. Emily and Jacob approached cautiously, not wanting to startle him. "Mr. Thorne," Jacob called out, his voice careful. "We need to talk." The old man turned slowly, his weathered face lined with sorrow. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "It's too late now. The waters have already claimed you." Emily shivered at his words, but she forced herself to stay focused. "Please, Mr. Thorne, we need to know what's happening. We saw Mr. Finch, he was on the cliff and then he just walked into the sea," Mr. Thorne finished for her, his eyes dark with understanding. "Yes, I know. I've seen it happen before." Emily's breath caught. "What do you mean?" The old man sighed, turning back to the ocean. "This village is cursed," he said quietly. "A long time ago, the villagers made a pact with the sea to protect themselves from the storms that ravaged the coast. They offered sacrifices, people from outside the village, in exchange for safety. But over time the sea began to demand more, not just lives but souls. Jacob frowned, his mind racing. Souls? You mean, these people aren't just dying, they're being taken? Mr. Thorne nodded, his expression grim. Taken into the depths, where they become part of the sea itself. They lose who they are, what they were. All that's left is shadows, Emily finished, her voice trembling. The figures we saw, they're the ones who've been taken. Mr. Thorne's silence was confirmation enough. Emily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The thought of being trapped in that dark, cold water, losing herself until she was nothing more than a shadow, was more terrifying than anything she'd ever imagined. Is there any way to stop it? Jacob asked, his voice tight with urgency. Any way to break the curse? The old man hesitated, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the fog met the sea. There is a way, he said slowly, but it comes at a great cost. What is it? Emily pressed, desperation clawing at her. We'll do anything. Mr. Thorne turned to face them, his eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to drown out all hope. To break the curse, you must offer yourselves willingly to the sea. Only then will the village be free. Emily's heart sank. You mean, we have to die? Not just die, Mr. Thorne corrected, his voice a whisper. You must surrender your souls. Only then will the waters be appeased. Jacob shook his head in disbelief. That's not a solution. That's suicide. But Mr. Thorne's expression didn't change. It's the only way. Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. They had come here for a peaceful getaway, and now they were being told that the only way to save themselves, and the village, was to give up everything. We need time to think, Jacob said, his voice shaking slightly. Mr. Thorne nodded. But not too long. The sea is patient, but it will not wait forever. As they turned to leave, Emily glanced back at the old man. He stood alone on the cliffs, staring out at the dark waters below, as if he too was waiting for the sea to call his name. Chapter 5. The final choice. Emily and Jacob walked back to the inn in silence, the weight of Mr. Thorne's words pressing down on them like a physical burden. The fog had thickened, shrouding the village in an oppressive gloom that seemed to mirror the despair growing in their hearts. The air was heavy with moisture, every breath tasting like salt and dread. Inside the inn, they found Mrs. Hawthorne waiting for them, her expression unreadable. The villagers had gathered in the dining room, their faces shadowed by flickering candlelight. The power had gone out, and the inn felt more like a tomb than a place of refuge. You spoke to him, didn't you? Mrs. Hawthorne's voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that made Emily flinch. Jacob nodded, his face pale. He told us everything. Mrs. Hawthorne sighed deeply, as though the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. Then you understand what must be done. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, the enormity of the situation crashing over her in waves. There has to be another way, she pleaded, her voice cracking. We can't just give up. Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze softened with something like pity. We've tried everything else, she said quietly. The sea's hold on this village is too strong. Once you're marked, there's no escape. It's only a matter of time before the waters take what they're owed. Jacob clenched his fists, his jaw set in a grim line. But why us? We didn't ask for this. We were just trying to get away for a few days. I know, Mrs. Hawthorne replied, her voice laced with regret. But the sea doesn't care about fairness. It only cares about the bargain that was made long ago. A bargain we're all bound to whether we want to be or not. The room fell silent, the villagers watching them with a mix of sorrow and resignation. Emily could feel their fear, their helplessness, and it only deepened her own despair. They were trapped, caught in a nightmare that had no end. Jacob looked at her, his eyes filled with anguish. Emily, what do we do? She wished she had an answer, a way out of this horrific situation. But the truth was she was as lost as he was. The thought of surrendering to the sea, of losing everything they were, was unbearable. But what choice did they have? We can't let it end like this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. There has to be something we can do. But even as she said the words, she knew they were futile. The sea's power was too great, its grip too strong. They were like pieces on a chessboard, being moved by forces they couldn't see or understand. Suddenly, Jacob's expression changed. A fierce determination flared in his eyes. "There is one thing we haven't tried," he said, his voice hardening. "If the sea demands a sacrifice, then maybe we can give it one that it didn't expect." Emily frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Jacob glanced at the villagers, then back at her. "The sea takes those who are marked, right? But what if we can offer it something more? Something that it wants even more than us?" Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes widened in alarm. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice sharp. "What you're suggesting, you don't understand the consequences." "I understand that we're out of options," Jacob shot back. "And I'm not going to just lie down and let it take us. We need to fight back." Emily's mind raced, trying to piece together what Jacob was saying. "You're talking about someone else?" she asked, horrified. Jacob hesitated, his expression torn. "Not someone," he said finally. "Something. The sea is alive, right? It wants something, power, control. If we can find a way to challenge that, maybe we can break the curse." Mrs. Hawthorne shook her head, her face pale. "You don't know what you're dealing with. The sea isn't just alive, it's ancient, powerful beyond anything you can imagine. If you try to fight it, you'll only make things worse." But Jacob wasn't listening. He was already moving, his mind set on his plan. "There has to be a way," he muttered to himself. "Something we can do." Emily followed him, her heart pounding with fear and uncertainty. "Jacob, please, we need to think this through." But Jacob was already heading for the door. "We don't have time," he said grimly. "If we don't act now, we're dead anyway. I'd rather go down fighting." Emily hesitated, torn between fear and love. She didn't want to lose him, but she also knew that staying here, doing nothing, was a death sentence. If there was even a chance that they could turn the tide, she had to take it. She nodded, her decision made. "I'm with you." Jacob gave her a tight, determined smile. "We'll figure this out. Together." As they left the inn, Emily could feel the villagers' eyes on them, filled with a mixture of hope and dread. They were the last chance for Blackwater Cove, the last hope for a village trapped in the grip of an ancient curse. But as they stepped out into the night, the fog swirling around them like a living thing, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. The sea was watching, waiting, and it wouldn't let them go so easily. They made their way down to the shoreline, the waves crashing against the rocks with a relentless fury. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, the wind howling like a beast in the darkness. "We need to find a way to draw it out," Jacob said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the sea. "To challenge it directly." Emily swallowed her fear, trying to keep her voice steady. "How do we do that?" Jacob stared out at the ocean, his expression hardening. "We make it angry." Before Emily could react, Jacob stepped forward, raising his arms to the sky. "You hear me?" he shouted into the wind, his voice filled with defiance. "We're not afraid of you. If you want us, come and get us." The sea seemed to pause for a moment, as if taken aback by his challenge. And then, with a deafening roar, the waves surged forward, crashing against the shore with a force that nearly knocked them off their feet. Emily grabbed Jacob's arm, her heart racing. "Jacob, what are you doing?" But Jacob didn't back down. He stood his ground, his eyes blazing with determination. "I'm not going to let it take us," he said through gritted teeth. "If it wants a fight, it's going to get one." The waves grew taller, rising up like dark, monstrous shapes, as if the sea itself was coming to life. Emily felt a cold dread settle over her, a deep, primal fear that told her they were facing something far beyond their understanding. And then, from the depths of the ocean, a figure began to emerge. Tall and shadowy, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, it rose from the water like a nightmare-given form. It was the embodiment of the sea's power, a force of nature that defied reason. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figure loomed over them, its presence filling the air with a crushing sense of doom. But Jacob didn't flinch. He took a step forward, his hand tightening around Emily's. "We're not afraid of you," he said again, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We're not going to let you take us." The figure paused, its glowing eyes fixed on them. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the wind dying down, the waves stilling. And then, with a low, rumbling growl, the figure began to move toward them, its form shifting and changing like smoke in the wind. Emily felt her heart seize with terror, but she held her ground, her grip on Jacob's hand tightening. "We have to do something," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jacob nodded, his eyes never leaving the figure. "I know. But what?" As the figure drew closer, Emily felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run. But she knew there was no escape. Whatever this thing was, it was too powerful, too ancient to be stopped by force alone. And then, in a moment of clarity, she understood. The sea wasn't just demanding a sacrifice, it was testing them. Testing their resolve, their willingness to face the darkness heat-in. "We have to accept it," she said suddenly, the realization hitting her like a bolt of lightning. Jacob turned to her, confusion and fear in his eyes. "What?" "We have to accept the darkness," Emily repeated, her voice gaining strength. "If we resist it, it will destroy us. But if we accept it, maybe we can break the curse." Jacob hesitated, his face pale with fear. "Are you sure?" Emily nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "It's the only way." Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, letting go of Jacob's hand. The figure loomed over her, its glowing eyes burning into her soul. But she didn't back down. Instead, she reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the shadowy form. The moment her fingers made contact, a shock of cold ran through her, freezing her to the core. But she held on, refusing to let go, even as the darkness began to seep into her, pulling her down into the depths. Jacob watched in horror, but before he could move, Emily's voice rang out, strong and clear. "Let us go," she said, her voice echoing through the night. "We accept your power, your darkness, but we won't let it consume us." For a moment, the figure hesitated, its form flickering like a dying flame. And then, slowly, it began to recede, the darkness retreating back into the sea. Emily gasped as the cold released its grip on her, stumbling backward into Jacob's arms. The figure dissolved into the waves, the ocean calming as quickly as it had risen. They stood there in stunned silence, watching as the fog lifted, revealing the village bathed in the soft light of the rising sun. The nightmare was over. But as they turned to leave, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had left something behind, a piece of itself that would stay with them forever. They had broken the curse, but at what cost?